Welcome to the Lead Every Day show. Our mission is to see a world well led. And our strategy to get there? To empower leaders like you to lead every day. So let's get to work.
We are talking all things culture today. I'm so excited. I got the culture expert with me. Welcome to the Lead Every Day show. I'm Randy Gravitt.
And I'm Mark Miller.
And that would make you the culture expert, Mr. Miller.
Well, yeah.
I don't know about the expert, but you have written about it, and I'm excited about this conversation because I think culture, Mark, is one of the biggest opportunities we have as leaders to create a great organizations, which we are talking to people all the time trying to do that. In fact, when we did the work around culture rules, when you wrote the book, Culture Rules, you'll remember that this is one of the most fascinating statistics ever. We did some work around that, and we talked to leaders all over the world, and they kept saying over and over, the number one driver you have toward performance is the ability to work on your culture and create a great culture. What was the mind-blowing part to me, I think was it number 11 or 12 on their list of priorities when we had them rank order their priorities. I think it was almost 70% of them said the number one driver you have is culture. And they have ranked it 11th on, this is how we use our time. I'm like, are you kidding me? You and I always joke, we're not giving a lot of time to our 11th priority. So I know there's some leaders out there who are struggling with culture. I talked to one last week. It is their issue. And a lot of times culture goes back to the leader. We're the ones who allow or enable. I found myself, I've got this little area in our organization where this is happening. I'm going, that's on me. I mean, you gotta own that at some point. And so today we're going to talk about some of those things that actually are really the toxins, we call them. They're the things that get in the way of culture. So I can't wait to pick your brain today on culture. I'm going to call you Mr. Culture today.
Yeah. Well, I will say that I've been a student and practitioner for decades. And for those that may be new to the show, you may not know that I grew up in a really great culture. I spent almost 45 years at Chick-fil-A at their corporate headquarters. And so as we did this research a few years ago, we weren't studying Chick-fil-A, but it was interesting after we spent years of study and reflection and millions of dollars talking to leaders and surveying leaders all over the country, I could actually see the culture rules that we wrote about in play in our organization. We didn't use the same language, but I would argue that that is another point of validation that leaders are the driver of culture.
That's great. And I'm going to make you unpack that at the end. You may know where I'm going with that. Our audience may even have a little suspicion of what we might do at the end here today, which will be good. But before we do, you mentioned you were in a healthy culture. Can you describe, Mark, what a healthy culture is? Let's talk about, so we're going to talk about some toxins, some things that are maybe unhealthy in cultures today. And actually, I'm excited. We're going to give some antidote to those toxins, some antidotes. I mean, I think it's going to be really good for us to be able to maybe do some self-reflection if we're listening today. Is this true in our organization? We're going to give them some ideas, things they can do to change that, which would be great. But let's start with, what is a healthy culture, Mark? When you say healthy at Chick-fil-A, like or anywhere else for that matter, we see all kind of healthy cultures. What would you describe that? How would you define it?
Well, first, we call it a high performance culture. And the first hallmark that you'll see is elite levels of performance sustained over time. But that's not all you need, because you actually could have an unhealthy culture that produces results, at least for a season. But you start with a foundation of performance. The second thing you'll see is alignment. You have the vast majority of the men and women in the organization are aligned and have rallied around the aspiration that leaders have put forth for the organization. And then third and finally, you see a relentless pursuit of improvement culturally. The best cultures never rest, because if you think you're done, you're done. So these high performance cultures are always saying, how can we enhance our culture?
That's great. All right. So if we think about the other side of that, let's make sure we understand what we're talking about when I say toxins here, because I want us to think it's unhealthy and unproductive. That's really, to me, those are the words. If there's unhealthy stuff going on, typically it'll be unproductive. Although you and I have talked before, you can have you can actually have performance in an unhealthy environment. It might not, it won't be reaching its potential, and it probably is going to be hard to sustain that. But I think what happens is we have these little things I call toxins. You've called them toxins as well. They sneak in, and somebody told me one time if you're eating a batch of cookies, it only takes a little bit of poison to ruin the whole batch. And I think that's a good reminder that if, and I'd be nice to have a cookie right now, but if we think about our cultures, it sometimes we have a little something going on, and we think we're able to overlook it. It won't be that big a deal. And these little things can become a big deal. They can actually wreck a culture over time. And so
Yeah.
I want us today to think about some of these things we've listed, we've talked about in the past, some of these things that may feel like a little thing at first, but they actually can grow into something that can wreck what we're trying to do. Now, this first one, let's
Before you go there,
Okay.
before you go there, I want to add one thing. They are little things, but for me, and I think you would agree with this, what constitutes a toxin is a pattern, not one moment, one unhealthy attitude or behavior or one thing that you said, well, that's not productive. So I think for leaders, we've got to be vigilant, and we're looking for patterns of these things. And as soon as we see them, to your point, we need to act, because toxins left unchecked will metastasize and they will kill organizations. So they start small in almost every case, but they can get out of hand really, really quick.
Yeah, that's a good reminder that it's a pattern of unproductive and really unhealthy behavior that just begins to seep in, and if we don't pay attention to it, to your point, it really can. I mean, as I said a minute ago, it can derail what we're trying to do. So let's start with the first one, and I think this one is a big one right now because, I mean, maybe forever it's been a big one, but it's been elevated in some of the conversations we've had lately because the engagement levels are so low. But it's this toxin of what we call indifference. If you have people on your team that are indifferent to what you're trying to do, and the engagement numbers, are they hovering still around 70% of people are disengaged, Mark? That's the last I saw, 75%, depending on where you look in the world. It's worse globally than it is in the U.S., but it's awful in the U.S. And a few months back, we're on an episode, and you said something I thought was just a really good reminder. So many people think it's an indictment on the American workforce. You said in a podcast, it's an indictment on leadership, because we're the ones allowing not just this toxin, but any of them. If we're the leader, we got to own that. And so if you're in an organization, you're listening today, and indifference is, you're just not sure if your people are really with you, it's going to be hard to go to the place you want to go. And so let's just start with indifference. Let's name that one. I think that's one of the early toxins we ought to be looking for.
Yeah, and let me say the first cousin is apathy. And you know when people don't care, and it impacts everything. And you've got to own that as a leader.
It shows up, Mark, as so many times that apathy and indifference can grow into negativity. And negativity can actually be a toxin. We don't talk about that so much, but it's huge. I've been saying for the last few months, I think it's really hard to go to a positive place with negative people. And so I would say beware of indifference and apathy and negativity to start with. Those to me they're major red flags, I would say.
Yes, agree.
All right, so you got another one? Give me another one.
Well, let's talk about paranoia, where people have a sense, whether founded or not, that everyone is against them, and they'll close in, they'll not want to share, they'll not want to collaborate, they'll be fearful that somebody else is going to take credit for their idea. They become very insular and isolated, and it's just not a good way to go through life. And it's really, in my mind, I'm not a psychologist, but it's a manifestation of fear. And if you've got a fearful workplace, you're not going to have a thriving high performance culture for sure.
That's good. I think that paranoia so many times manifests itself in what I would call mistrust. That would be another one of these toxins. It shows up early. we'll do a review on this later, but you remember Patrick Lencioni talks about the number one dysfunction of so many teams is a lack of trust and mistrust in organizations.
Mm-hmm.
It is rampant. And so there might be people listening today, and if you really were honest, you would go, I'm not sure we trust each other. There's actually some things you can do there. So but it's a toxin. You'll never reach your potential if you don't have trust in your teams and in your organization.
And I would say that often that's really a mistrust in leadership. Now, it may have spread to your coworkers, but I think there's an indictment potentially for us as leaders if we have a culture where mistrust has become the norm, and we need to deal with it.
Yeah, that's really a given. I mean, that we do, and yet we don't pay as much attention to it maybe as we should. All right, so we hear people say all the time that we don't communicate well. We don't have a lack of we have a lack of communication in our organization, and I think that's true. But let's put some specifics to that. I think it shows up as what you've called deafness, and meaning that we just don't. I mean, people might be talking to each other, but we're just not listening to each other. We don't hear what they're saying, and I think that again, to me, this is a toxic mix. If I say something to you and I don't feel like you hear me, if I'm taking the time to communicate and I feel like I say it, but you just don't, you might even say, I hear what you're saying, and then you don't do anything. You don't make any change. You know, you've said for years that the people closest to the problems are many times closest to the solutions. And so if we start talking to frontline people and they have these ideas or they have things that we could do and we don't listen to what they're really saying, we don't ever give any, credence to it, I think we can lose people pretty quickly. And so there's a lot of toxic behavior going on where we don't listen to each other as well.
Yeah. And on all of these, they have implication and application with your peers, your coworkers, but also with leadership. Because in this one particularly, maybe people aren't listening to each other, but where did that behavior come from? Where was it modeled? Why is it tolerated? And perhaps we're not doing a good job of listening as leaders. I think we've got to be really careful, because once people figure out that they're not going to be heard, again, the chances of creating what you want to create go almost to zero.
Yeah. All right, Mark. So I was in an organization one time where there was what you call whiplash. Some of the whiplash was going on. Will you describe the toxin of whiplash? Because I've felt it, and it's really hard when that happens. Talk about whiplash.
Yeah, and this one is most often applied directly to leaders. And when it's a leader has a new idea, followed by a new idea, followed by a new idea, followed by a new strategy, followed by a new priority, followed by we're going to redo the budget, we're going to redo the structure. It's when there's so much change that the previous change cannot be embraced, adopted, and metastasized into the organization. And what ultimately happens is people start ignoring the new vision because experience teaches them that there'll be another one soon. Once you start ignoring a leader's vision, what happens then? Well, your engagement goes down, your passion, your discretionary effort, your desire, everything goes down if you don't feel like you're pursuing something that's purposeful. If you feel like you're pursuing something that's actually not going to come to be, it's not going to come to fruition because it's going to change again too quickly. And so I think leaders, there's some judgment required here, but you can't have a new vision or a new strategy every week, every month. You probably can't even have one every 6 months before the organization starts to tune you out.
Yeah, the vision of the week, you just jerk everybody around, and you do lose credibility as a leader if you do that, for sure. Okay, so here's one that people might not think of, but we call it politeness. If we almost have this sense, if we're not careful, of being too nice in these organizations, and if we don't hold people to a standard, we believe, I know you and I believe, that accountability actually is a gift if we frame it the correct way. Feedback can be a tremendous gift as well if we create that kind of culture. But if we're going to just be nice to each other and tell each other what we want to hear, and we have yes men or women around us, if we're the leader, and there's just this almost a nice culture, it ends up being not nice, right? We'll never reach our potential if we're not willing to tell each other the truth. And I would just say here, and I don't want to give the answer to this yet, but to me, I think sometimes we have to say hard things, but we have to say them in the right way. We can say the right thing in the right way, and if we avoid that communication, that's almost as bad as the deafness. I don't hear you, but I'm not willing to tell you what I'm thinking. All kind of stuff there in the communication bucket that can be toxic in an organization.
Yeah, it's not good. So I think you summed it up well. It just creeps in. There's and let me say this. I think it's very, very selfish, because the person is so concerned about an individual's response that they're willing to set truth aside, set the facts aside, set their own opinion and experience aside. Because if I disagree, if I have a counter position here, then what will they think of me? So it's very selfish when you get into this overly nice corporate kindness. It's a disservice to everybody.
Corporate kindness, that's a good way to say it. It really can be toxic. Okay, talk about subcultures, Mark. You wrote a little bit about subcultures. They can creep in and actually be at war with the overall what we're trying to create as a culture. Can you talk for a second about subcultures?
Yeah, and let me say this. And we've been working on the language here. I think the way that we're going to talk about it going forward is a subculture is normal and natural. You're going to have a different culture in accounting than you will in marketing or innovation or human resources or finance. The toxin that we have to look out for are countercultures. A subculture is a culture that's appropriate for that work group, that team, that department, or that division, based on the temperament and personality of the leader, based on the work they're charged to do, their giftedness. And so again, you will have those different subcultures. But a counterculture is when people are working against the aspiration of the organization. And it may not be intentional. It may not be deliberate, but nonetheless, if the organization is about excellence and there's a team somewhere that says, we think the right answer is just to get work out fast and we'll fix it later, well, that's a counterculture. You've got a group of people that are actually working opposed to the stated aspiration of the organization. That's what you've got to be able to identify and deal with as quickly as possible.
Okay, so I want to shift over to the leader here for a second. And our last toxin, I'll call self-deception. I think if I'm not careful, they call them blind spots for a reason, right? We can't see them. And sometimes we have these things that we can see, and we deceive ourselves into thinking they're not that big of a deal, when they end up affecting others. I was sharing with a leader recently about how a decision I made I knew affected more than just myself, and we had to talk through that. And so I think if we're not careful, we can deceive ourselves into thinking that our behavior is not that unproductive, not that unhealthy, or we can deceive ourselves into thinking these toxins even that we may have named are not patterns. They're just, like you said a minute ago, they just showed up. That's just a one-time thing. And that one-time thing, unfortunately, has been showing up every week for 8 months. And we're just it's almost like we're deceiving ourselves in saying this really doesn't have a foothold in our organization. And so I think we have to be careful there. So I just remind everybody listening, make sure that you're paying attention, not just to the list of toxins, but to yourself and what you're allowing. And I want us, that's the shift to me. I want us to go to these antidotes and
before we do, I'm going to say,
okay, you want to make a comment? Great.
Well, I just want to say this. We gave you a pretty good list, and it's a pretty diverse list. This is not the total list of toxins. So
it's not
use this to help guide your thinking, but it's an abbreviated list. You can find things like unhealthy competition. One of the things we used to combat at Chick-fil-A is a loss of procedural discipline. Once you know what works and there's a standard operating procedure, you've got to have people who are willing to follow the procedure. And if you lose that, then all kind of things can unravel. So make your own list. Again, it's a pattern of unhealthy and unproductive behavior. And so just take our list as a starting point. That'll cover a whole lot of the stuff you'll encounter, but don't feel like that's the complete set.
Yeah, that's a great reminder, Mark. I was going to say there as we were talking about the leader and the shift, but I like your comment there because it reminds me that whenever we see any of these or any others that we may not have listed, leaders have to intervene. I mean, it's my responsibility. If I'm the leader, I've got to intervene. And the listener today may be thinking, okay, I've got a list. There's 3 or 4 of those y'all talked about probably going on our organization. What do I do? So let's talk, Mark. There's different scenarios, and you wrote about these. I love this. It's kind of a preview to the end of our conversation today, but I think these antidotes are really good. And one of the things you wrote about was, let's start with this one. You talked about ripping the Band-Aid off. And so if we have an unhealthy something going on, a pattern of behavior, we can have meeting and a meeting, and the next thing you know, we're just kind of dancing around the issue. There are times when we need to rip the Band-Aid off. And I know you have an example of this that you wrote about in society at whole. I mean, I want you to give that example, but anything you want to say about, when to rip the Band-Aid, talk about that.
Yeah. I think when the consequence of inaction is unimaginable, when the consequences of inaction could be catastrophic, when the stakes are so high, you don't need to spend months and months and months and months. The leader needs to intervene. Now, I'm not saying you'll solve the problem, but the leader has to intervene and say, we are going to deal with this, and we're going to deal with it now. And it is probably, of the half dozen or so countermeasures and strategies that we're going to share, it's probably the most painful, but the leader has to make the call. The example, it's what President Reagan did when the space shuttle exploded, and killed the entire crew. He shut down NASA and said, we're gonna figure out what happened. We're gonna figure out what are the cultural roots that created the conditions for this tragedy, and in essence changed the culture of NASA. But he shut it down. He said, we're going to rip the Band-Aid, right? Not his language, ours. But this is too important. This is lives. This is America on the global stage. This is the future of space exploration. We've got to figure this out. And so now I'll just say this is all. I won't do this on all of them, but let me tell you, every one of these interventions has consequence. And the near-term consequence you're hoping and praying for is it will solve the problem. But what leaders also have to think through is, if you successfully change the culture, you have changed the behaviors of your culture, and there will be consequences. So in NASA's case, they became so safety-oriented that they have had real difficulty over the last however many 25, 30 years, whenever we would date that, of innovation. It's like they are so risk averse now. And so I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm not judging it at all, but you got to be careful. When you change a culture and you do it successfully, you will change behaviors. And so they went from, hey, we're willing to take some risk, to we'll take no risk. And it has slowed space exploration.
Yeah, that's leaders need to think through what are the ramifications of the change. But our point here is, if you're pulling a Band-Aid off and you pull it off really slow, it's still going to hurt. It's almost like you get the pain over with if you rip it. And so I would almost say, Mark, the bigger your cultural toxin, maybe the more you need to take this rip the Band-Aid approach. I mean, you just got to, we know we're going to have to do it. We got to do this because it's going to be pain. It's going to be more painful if we don't do something. And so, what is the pain caused by a toxic culture day after day? It's turnover, it's lack of performance, it's all these things. So many things there. Okay, that's great. All right, here's another one, Mark. Sometimes leaders, You know, I love the basketball tournaments going on right now. And at the end of the game, it's so cool when somebody wants the ball in their hand, the leader, and he's like, I'm making this shot, or she's like, I'm going to knock this down. We're going to win this game. There's times when leaders have to call their shot. And I want you to talk about that in the cultural context. You'll probably be watching some basketball too here in the next week or two, but I want you to think about it in the cultural context. What do you mean when you say call your shot?
Well, it's when a leader steps forward and says, here's what we're going to do. And then they actually lead the organization to do it. Patrick Doyle did this twice with Domino's. The first time he did it, it's when he realized they had bad pizza, and he said, we're going to own it and we're going to fix it. And then the second time he did it is when he moved them more towards an IT bias. I mean, there have been reports that they think they're an IT company. They just sell pizza. And so they're trying to figure out all these different platforms and all these different apps and all these different ways that you can get their pizza. And he literally just said, here's what we're going to do. And he did it. Just call your shot. And maybe that's what you need to do.
That's good. All right, another way you can move culture, your old friend Jack Strack had, I think it was at Springfield Manufacturing. You can tell the story here, Mark, but he had the idea of expanding ownership and talked about how that helped change their culture. Can you tell Jack's story a little bit? Give our audience a little flavor for Jack.
Yeah, real simply, Jack is an amazing businessman, and he and some other employees bought a company out of bankruptcy. They paid 10 cents a share for the stock, and I don't know how many times it split, maybe 100 times since then, and they've had to start all these other businesses because they raised up all these other leaders. And Jack's idea was, let's get everybody involved. In fact, there's a great book called The Great Game of Business, which tells the story of Springfield Remanufacturing Corporation, SRC. And they just said, let's get everybody in the game, the game of business, and let's educate people and train people and recognize people and reward people for playing the game well. And he basically built an organization full of owners, and their results have been phenomenal.
That's fantastic. I always love that story about Jack and remarkable what they've been able to do, or were able to do with that. Okay, so I'm in a girl family here. We're big Broadway people. I say we're big. I've been sucked into several Broadway plays. And had such a great time when you go to New York and you see some plays. Even gotten pulled into one over in London one time with a couple of my daughters and my wife. But all those plays that are on Broadway don't start on Broadway. Mark, there's something you've written about here called Take It Off Broadway. Talk about that as it connects to the culture. If somebody's got a toxin here and they want to work on that, what's the benefit of taking it off Broadway? What do you even mean by that? And what's the opportunity here?
Well, some things, as we've mentioned, need big, bold pronouncements, CEO intervention, so forth and so on. But sometimes you can do small experiments that will help solve problems. In fact, in the book, we talk about Google does a lot of this, a lot of experiments, and just try things. And they would say, away from the bright lights. Let's just try it. Let's try this in one office. And if it works, let's try it in a second office. And then if it works there again, let's export it to our entire organization. So you wouldn't do this with things that were of the magnitude of our previous examples, right? It's no substitute for rip the Band-Aid, but one quick example, Google wanted to help their employees plan for a more successful life. I'm paraphrasing, but they were trying to get people to think about their life beyond their job. And so they said it would be helpful if when men and women would retire, they would have enough money to retire. And so they said, let's try some experiments regarding how we could encourage people to actually invest in their 401k. Now, this is beyond what Google was already doing and matching and other things. They said, this is really not a healthy and appropriate behavior, and we'd like to change it, but it doesn't require a CEO pronouncement. So they started tweaking the communications that they sent to people, asking them or offering them the opportunity to participate. And they did A/B testing. Does that surprise you, coming out of Google? They said, if we send this email, more people will contribute to their 401k. And they said, okay, well, next quarter, let's do it again and do another A/B test. And they're actually changing the culture, and their employees are becoming more savers. And Google's going, this is good because they're going to have a better life because of this cultural influence. And all they did was change the emails that they were sending out to people. Clearly changed the culture by taking that off Broadway.
Yeah, that's great. You could even say they're a cousin to this next idea is to think small. You can start with just one small thing, Mark, and begin to make progress toward a brighter culture, toward your aspiration would be the way you would say it. And so I love the idea of thinking small as well. You got a thought there?
Yeah, let me just give you there's several examples. Let me give you a Chick-fil-A example. It was about 15 years ago or so that Truett Cathy said, hey, when somebody says thank you, I want us to say my pleasure in response. You say, well, that's a relatively insignificant ask and maybe a relatively insignificant behavior. But over the last 15 years, that has morphed into an aspiration to create a culture of hospitality. And it began with something very, very small. And I think if you start looking for it, you can find other examples when leaders find small, seemingly insignificant, maybe even trivial behaviors that will have a long, consequential impact on an organization.
Well, and one of the things that we would say is that your changes that you're making and your step toward a healthy culture could literally change the game, not just for your organization, but that would be our next one. You can change the game for everybody. I was in an airport a while back. I've told this story before, and I'm buying a cup of coffee, and there's a young lady who's taking my order at just a coffee shop, and I say thank you, and she says my pleasure. I'm sitting there thinking, it's not your pleasure. It's Chick-fil-A's pleasure. You stole that. Actually, Truett told the story, or you've told me the story of how Truett, it took him a decade to get his own operators to say my pleasure. And now his stick-to-itiveness, before he passed away, he stayed the course. You got to watch it from the front row, Mark. And now it has literally changed the culture. So many people are more cognizant of the importance of customer service because of some of Truett's commitment back in the day. I believe that. And so you never know. These things can have a ripple effect, not just to your employees, but in Google's case, to their lives after Google, and also, in Chick-fil-A's example, to the culture at large. And so I love that we have a chance here to make things better everywhere, not just in our own little sphere of influence.
Yeah. And you did mention the next countermeasure is you may want to literally change the game. And I would say this strategy is not used that often, but if you see an opportunity to change the game for an entire industry, well, why not be at the front end of that?
Yeah.
And it, again, certainly would benefit your organization, assuming you're in the driver's seat. The example that we talk about briefly in the book is the Mayo Clinic. And I would argue that the jury is still out, but they are literally trying to change the way the world thinks about and delivers healthcare. And they have unapologetically said, we're going to try to change the game. And they're doing all the things that you would imagine and probably a lot of things you wouldn't. But that is their intent because it will strengthen their culture and strengthen the world through their efforts. So sometimes you need to think big and then think bigger again.
All right, so let's think holistically here. If I'm that leader, you've talked about, Mark, the power of connecting the dots. We'll use that as our last antidote today. Can you talk about how a leader can literally connect dots here between some of these things that are going on? Give us a word of encouragement on that one.
Well, sometimes you need to do or want to do more than one thing. You may have multiple issues at play, and there's nothing to say that you could not attack those individually and separately. And maybe sometimes that's the right answer. Again, all of this is infused with your judgment. based on your knowledge of your organization and your expertise and your passion and your belief in the consequences of these various things that you're trying to change. But if you can combine some of these things, often you can find new levels of passion, energy, and excitement. And many would argue that's what President Lincoln did when he was trying to preserve the Union and end slavery. He wanted to do both, but when he was able to connect those, a lot of folks feel like that was what made the difference when he had these two compelling things that he wanted to address, and he found a way to connect them. So once you make your list of toxins that you're trying to eradicate, see if any of them could work together. It might give you some added momentum.
Hopefully some of these antidotes that we've given you, if you're listening today, will help you take back your culture, take it to that place that you want to. Okay, so I'm gonna hold up a book here, Mark. We're gonna talk about this one today. We got a couple minutes left. Culture Rules. Got your name across the bottom. Beautiful cover here. This book's been out for a couple years now. This book is so good, Mark. I'll call you Captain Culture again. Give us a little. I want you to give me a little. What am I going to get if I read this book? If I'm listening here and I'm not read Culture Rules, talk to me. And let me get you to jump off with this phrase right here. And you may be going to say this anyway, but one of the things you've said is that you can build a culture by design, or you'll have one by default. If you're going to design one, I don't know of a better way to start than Culture Rules. Take us down that road here.
Yeah, well, let me just give it to you really, really quick. The work that the team and I did several years ago was in response to the stat that Randy shared earlier. Over 70% of U.S. leaders say that culture is the number one driver of performance. However, it's number 12 on their priority list. And as Randy mentioned, I'm not working on my 12th priority, and my bet is you're not working on yours, at least not strategically.
I don't even know what mine is, Mark.
Yeah, you got to try to figure that out. So we went to work and said, how do we help leaders close this knowing-doing gap? And this book is the product of that exploration. We decided at the end of the day that we needed to help leaders with how to build a high-performance culture. And I'll just go ahead and give it to you at the highest level. We have identified 3 culture rules that every leader at every level should be engaged in on a daily basis. The first is to aspire, to share your hopes and dreams for your culture. So many leaders have not been able or willing to tell people what is our aspiration, what does the culture look like that we're trying to build. Number 2 is to amplify. This is to always be looking for ways to reinforce the aspiration. This is when it gets real. This is when people think, oh, she's serious. Oh, I think we're really going to do this. Oh, I better get on board. And we've given some strategies and tactics in the book, things that leaders can do around role modeling, around storytelling, around systems and processes, even strategic repetition will help amplify the aspiration. And then number 3, where we spent most of our time today, the third rule is to adapt, to always be looking for ways to enhance your culture. Now, today we talked about what to do if your culture is not healthy, if you've got toxins at a level that need an intervention. But you can also decide that you need to leverage your strengths. You may want to add new capabilities. So there's some other ways that you can adapt. But what we believe is that any leader on the planet who's willing to aspire, amplify, and adapt, you can build the culture of your dreams.
That's so good. I love it. Thank you so much for your contribution, Mark, to the world with that book. I'll just say thanks on behalf of all the others who have benefited from that. And you and I actually wrote a field guide and a quick start guide around that as well. And so I think you have a journal that you did. There's all kind of resources around that. And so if anybody would like to pick up a copy of Culture Rules or any of those other resources, they can go to leadeveryday.com, and I think they're all available there in the shop. You can also get the book at wherever you buy your books, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, those places. You feel free to pick one up if you've not picked up Culture Rules and you're in charge of any kind of culture. You don't have to be in charge of an organization to be in charge of a culture. I want to encourage you to lean into culture rules. It will help you with a game plan on how to build, as Mark said, the culture of your dreams. How cool would that be? So we'll leave it there, Mark. It's good conversation. I hope for our audience that they will begin to identify any of those things that are becoming unhealthy and unproductive patterns in their organizations, and they will eradicate those so that we can go to high performance places. That nothing would make you and I happier, I know, than to hear our listeners are building high performance cultures. I mean, it makes the world better. When we make it better, it makes it better for everybody else around us. So that would be our hope for you. We'll be back with you next time. Remember, the best leaders lead every day.